So in that sense, I want to democratize the story of innovation. I want to make it clear that anyone can do it.
The basic question that a writer asks, I think, is, what should I write about? And, that's the biggest question. There's no help for you either. And it's a total mystery.
But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard system.
We're absolutely delighted to be back here with our edition, albeit digitally, of JLF Houston. There are so many wonderful authors and speakers who you will hear over the next few days. And I hope they will power your imagination as they have ours to look into the future, into a brighter tomorrow.
On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, Asia Society, and Imprint, we welcome you to the second session of Day 2 of JLF Houston 2021 Virtual Edition. Presenting Hyphenations, Vinod Busjeet and Jenny Bhatt in conversation with Parul Kapur Hinzen. Hyphenations assume a heavy history and unique role in diaspora writing, binding Indian origin with trans-Indian experiences. Vinod Busjeet's literary debut, Silent Winds, Dry Seas, began as a memoir, now a provocative novel about indentured Indian communities in mid-century Mauritius. Jenny Bhatt is a writer, translator, and critic whose debut short story collection, Each of Us Killers, depicts the lives of the Indian diaspora and the socio-cultural boundaries which frame them. In conversation today, with critic and writer Parul Kapur Hinzen, they discuss the ways in which they uphold, amalgamate, and recreate their identity, and yet remain rooted in their concept of home. Vinod Busjeet was born in Mauritius. He holds degrees from Wesleyan, New York, and Harvard universities. He's worked as a secondary school teacher in Mauritius and has held senior positions at the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. Silent Winds, Dry Seas is his first book. Jenny Bhatt is a writer, literary translator, book critic, and writing instructor at Writing Workshops Dallas. She's also the founder of Desi Books, a global multimedia platform for South Asian literature. Her story collection, Each of Us Killers, was out in September 2020, and her translation, Ratnodholi, The Best Stories of Dhumketu, was published the following month. Parul Kapur Hinzen is a journalist, critic, and fiction writer with an MFA from Columbia University. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and The Wall Street Journal Europe. She's at work on a novel about love and corruption in the devastating aftermath of the partition of India. Please do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. We have struggled to bring you JLF Houston 2021 without charging a registration fee. Please support us as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Simply click on the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution will be greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Hyphenations, Vinod Busjeet and Jenny Bhatt in conversation with Parul Kapur Hinzen. Over to you, Parul.
Thank you, Sharupa, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this session on hyphenations, on writers living with hyphenated or multiple identities outside the culture where they were born. I'm here with two wonderful writers and friends in the Desi literary community here in the US, Vinod Busjeet and Jenny Bhatt. And we'll be getting into both their books and their experiences as writers who've actually made several moves out of India in Vinod's case, his ancestors, and in Jenny's, her coming over out of India on her own. But before we get into that, I just wanted to talk about the Indian diaspora, to give a little historical overview. So our stories and the stories of so many other Indian writers make sense in a historical context. The Indian diaspora is the largest diaspora of people in the world. It is 18 million people of Indian origin living outside India, according to a recent UN report, but I've also read numbers as high as 32 million. And, if we question why are there so many Indians living outside India? I think the answer lies in colonialism and in the economic devastation of India by the British Empire. So this diaspora has occurred in waves. Vinod can talk about the first wave, which is indentured labor, which occurred in the 19th century when the British outlawed slavery, and they in the 1830s, and they needed people to work in their plantation colonies all over the world, the Caribbean, Mauritius, Fiji, Malaysia, mostly sugarcane, but there were other crops also. And so they recruited very poor Indian villagers, especially from central India and Bihar, because they were agriculturalists. And so they were recruited, coerced, tricked, many different ways of getting them to leave India and to go to these islands and in other communities, South Africa, to work on colonial plantations. And they essentially replaced enslaved people. And then you have the second wave, which is almost a century later, which I realize I'm a part of. And that's in the 1960s, late 60s, America opened up its doors to Asian immigrants. My father was part of that, which was a different group of people, but also recruited essentially for their labor and the work and the skills they brought, which was educated professionals. A lot of US hospitals recruited doctors, there were financial professionals, engineers, and they left India. And you could say, well, they left several decades after independence. So how is that related to colonialism? But that is related because the Indian economy was devastated. It takes a long time to get over 250 years of economic, savagery in a sense, because the British Empire was a self-enrichment scheme. And so India was severely underdeveloped. So people like my father knew that they could make more money, they could have a better life, even housing, whatever, everything that would be more possible in the United States. And then, and there's actually 4.5 million Indians now, where there was, I think, like 30,000 when we came in '69. So it's been a huge diaspora to the US. And then finally, Jenny can talk about this, the tech industry that has seen many, many Indian engineers, software people, computer engineers leaving India, I think somewhere in the 90s maybe, and till today, there's, it's a large exodus of people also. So that's the historical context. And Vinod, I thought I'll start with you. And if you can tell us, it's a two-part question. If you could tell us first about, I know you've made some discoveries about your ancestors who left India. If you can tell us what you've found out about them. And though they replaced enslaved people in Mauritius, I know you feel like there's a distinction in how they were treated in many ways the same as enslaved people, same living conditions, harsh treatment, hard labor. But you think there's a distinction that allowed them to preserve their identity. So I was wondering if you could talk about that. And then if you could jump forward into your novel, which takes place almost a century after the ancestors arrived. And what is the Indian community that has evolved out of those ancestors arriving? How does the Indian community define itself in mid-century Mauritius, mid-20th century? Are they at home in Mauritius? Are they people who still feel displaced? And how do they define themselves?
Thanks, Parul, and thanks to JLF for hosting us and for giving me the opportunity to talk about Mauritius and Indians in Mauritius and about my novel. So my ancestor left India in 1853 at the age of 17. And, the British kept good archives, and I can trace not only my paternal ancestor, but my maternal ancestor as well. He came 10 years later. The Indians came to Mauritius between 1835 to 1875. Though during the French period, the French brought in artisans from Pondichéry. Most of them were free men. They were free. Some of them were slaves. So the bulk of indentured laborers came during the British period. And what's interesting is the British, when they took over the island in 1810, they agreed to respect French laws, French customs, and the French language. Similarly, when they brought in Indians from Bihar and UP mostly, they, unlike the enslaved people, the British sort of let the Indians keep their names, their identity, their religion, their customs, their rituals. The enslaved people were brought in by the French, and they essentially lost their sort of their links to Africa and their sort of African cultural roots. Though these days there is an attempt to revive those. So that's what Parul meant by the difference between the ways the Indians were treated in terms of religion, culture, and so on. Now, I came across an interesting hypothesis during an interview on my book, and it was the hypothesis was that this may have been part of the British strategy. Let the Indians keep their religion, their rituals, and so on, because that would provide them comfort and enable them to deal with their harsh conditions on the sugarcane plantations much better. So that's something which, I mean, I haven't seen historians sort of explore that, but that's an interesting hypothesis. Now, fast forward to today. Today, 65% of the population of Mauritius is of Indian origin. I would say of these, 55% is Hindu, 10% is Muslim. About 25 to 30% of the population is of African origin, and there are various degrees of mixture with the white population, and they are called Creole or Creoles, and there is a Creole culture associated with them. And the remaining 5% are Chinese and French. Now, the issue of hyphenation, in the period leading up to independence, we had the hyphenations were Indo-Mauritian, Franco-Mauritian, Sino-Mauritian. What's interesting is that there is no such term as Afro-Mauritian. Creole, that's how they're called, and that's how they call themselves. And so that's the hyphenation part. Now, the topic today is how did the Indians sort of maintain their identity and amalgamate and create their identity. So they maintain their identity mostly through religion and rituals. If you go to Mauritius today, we celebrate all the major religious festivals, Shivratri, Ganga Asnan, Durga Puja. We still have Diwali and Holi, and in fact, culturally, I mean, Indian culture is very vibrant in Mauritius. I would say that the population of Indian ancestry, they look to India as of their cultural motherland. I must say also that it's in a way a glorified vision of India. Kind of the India many visualize is the India of the rishis, the India of the Ramayana, you know, the India of Gandhi and Nehru. That's kind of an idealized view of India. Though now that more and more Mauritians are traveling and going to India, they face the reality. And also you have the internet and TV. Now, they kind of amalgamated and recreated their identity through absorbing and adopting the Creole language and the French language and the cultures that are expressed through these languages. Everybody in Mauritius speaks Creole. In my case, I was fluent in Bhojpuri till the age of 8 or so. But then afterwards, I lost most of my Bhojpuri. The language I can say I grew up with is Creole. Everyone speaks Creole, regardless of the community they are from. And the language that is sort of written, that is the most used, is French. All the daily newspapers are in French. English is an administrative language, institutional language, but you don't speak it daily. So culturally, the predominant influences in Mauritius are Indian and French. And so that's how I would say Indians have adjusted and we become Mauritian through the use of the Creole language and through adopting, like for instance, we have the Sega, which is the sort of the African rhythm, the African dance and African songs, which the enslaved people brought over. So to kind of summarize, and a Mauritian of Indian origin is someone who is an observant Hindu or Muslim, who eats curry and rice and dal puri, but speaks French and Creole. And when he goes to the beach, he will dance and sing the Sega. So in a nutshell. Maybe quickly, I'll end with this on the status of Indian languages in Mauritius. Oriental languages in Mauritius, Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, and so on, have enjoyed a resurgence after independence because these are now taught at the high school level. In my days, they were not. And that explains why in my family, my younger siblings, they can read and write Hindi, I can't. So, I mean, that's kind of what I have to say for now.
Yeah, thanks, Vinod. Yeah, it was a very illuminating about the position of the Indian community there. Jenny, I wanted to ask you, you have a very different journey out of India. Obviously, Vinod grew up in a family that had been in Mauritius for generations. You left India on your own, I think, as a student. So can you tell us about, what was your journey out of India like? And I'm just wondering also about what pressures, if there were any external pressures that might have caused you to leave. I was talking about colonialism and the long after effects. And then, of course, I kind of didn't mention, but the Indian government itself, as a reaction to that economic devastation of colonialism, had shut its doors, shut the economy to Western investment, and that had restricted the Indian economy. It was a self-defensive move not to be dominated against by the West. So, so India had restricted economy for many decades after the British left, partly by their own fault of closing everything down. So I'm just wondering, what were the pressures maybe that caused you to leave? And as a result of your journey, which has, I know, been 20 years or more, what kind of hyphenations or identities do you bridge within yourself? And then if you can tie that to your fiction, what kind of characters are you interested in writing about, maybe as a result of all of this, migration, this personal migration of yours?
Thank you, Parul, and thank you, JLF, for hosting us for this terrific topic. I mean, it's such a layered and complex topic, so I know there's a lot we could say. To answer your questions, Parul, I left India right before the liberalization began in '91. In fact, my process in terms of leaving as a student had begun in, I think, at the end of '89 even, because it does take time. You have to take exams and you have to get your visas, and there's a whole lot of things that have to happen because they don't make it easy. Oh, they didn't make it easy back then. Anyways, so I left before that. So you're right about what was happening within the Indian economy as being very constricting and very restrictive. And in my case, what happened was, out of my siblings, I was the one who was more academic. And so my parents felt, well, you know, we want to give her a good chance to get somewhere. And so I left as a student, and I went initially to the UK. Now, what's interesting, as I was listening to Vinod talk about how, you know, immigrants who went to Mauritius, religion and ritual were part of their lives, or how they kind of stayed with their roots. And I was thinking about how I did that in, you know, 91. And here's the interesting thing for me. When I was at university there, first of all, I had no scholarship or anything, you know, and so I was working 2 jobs to be able to pay my expenses and my educational costs and everything. So even though the university had a small Indian Students Association, I wasn't able to even approach or you know, be with them, be around other Indians. And I was in a small town, a small manufacturing town that was predominantly white. And so my way of staying connected to my roots was, you know, the cheapest and most affordable to students like me, which was through books. And, you know, if I had to say literature was my religion and the library was my temple, that's where I spent most of my free time when I wasn't working and when I wasn't studying. And so that's how I stayed connected, reading books by writers that reminded me of home in a way. And then, you know, obviously then I joined, after studying, I joined the workforce in the UK. And again, the jobs I got, I was in towns that literally, I was the first, for example, I was the first Indian and the first woman engineer hired into my company there at the time. And so, you know, that gives you a sense of how conservative and in the industry that I was in at the time was. And anyway, so then again, literature was my go-to. That's how I stayed connected with my roots, my country. That's what I read about. And I read obviously I read not just in English, I also read in Gujarati back then. So I would have, my parents would send me books in Gujarati, and that was another way for me to stay connected. Then I moved to the US. Again, it was through work. It was through the same company. But again, I was located or stationed in mostly small town US. And so, for example, rural Michigan, or, you know, small town Ohio, or, you know, those were the kinds of places that I had moved to. So again, I remember there would not, you know, for example, when 9/11 happened, I remember being at that time the only South Asian person in the office watching the news as the towers were being hit. So that gives you a sense of how, you know, even though we were considered fairly well-off South Asians or Indian Americans working, we had a salary, we had a work permit, whatever the case may be, but we were very much isolated in terms of community, in terms of being able to feel like we're part of a community. And so for me, again, as I said, I mean, from the very earliest, ever since I left India, I was a reader before, of course, but I felt more drawn and more, it was a way to connect. It was a way to stay connected, stay with my roots, because I wasn't a religious person. And so books and literature and that sort of thing. Eventually, of course, when I moved to larger cities, like, you know, when I moved to California, the Bay Area, of course, there's a much larger Indian community there. And I had family there. And so it was a different story. But I think coming back to what Vinod has said, I think anyone, whenever we move somewhere brand new and we don't know anyone, we're always going to look for ways to connect. And religion gives us one way because there are rituals. Reading, literature gives us popular culture, if you like, you know, gives us another way to connect. And that was my way. And clearly, coming to your second question, all of that has informed my writing. And I would say, I mean, obviously, a lot of the short stories that I began to initially write when I first started to take writing workshops in the US, which was after 9/11. I think 2001 or 2 was my first writing workshop that I took. And the works that I initially began to write were not works about or in India, because I was trying to grapple with my own identity and where I found my place in the world and where I found myself. And I was very much drawn to writing about people like myself, working people, people who had issues of workplace conflicts. And in fact, that is the central theme of my collection, Each of Us Killers, which is the whole collection is centered around different kinds of workplaces, and the protagonists are dealing with particular issues. Now, I will say, of course, that collection is not just set in the US. There are stories that are set in India, there are stories that are set in the UK, because those are all the places where I have lived and worked. And in fact, I wrote the book during the time when I had returned to India. In 2014, after my mother passed away, I wanted to go back and finish a project that she and I had been talking about for years, which was translation of one of her favorite Gujarati writers. And after she passed away, as usual, you have all that, oh, I wish I had done this and I wish I had done that. And so I inherited her personal library, which was full of this writer's books. And I thought, well, if that's not a sign, I don't know what is. And so I moved back. I left my job and everything and moved back to India in 2014 to work on translation work. But alongside, I was writing my own stories. And so therefore, some of the stories in my collection are also based in India, but again, they are working people. Because what I found, interestingly, to your point about how after India opened up economically and the jobs situation has changed drastically, I would say, just in the last 20 years, where, I think there's a large population, but there's also a lot of jobs and a lot of people are working now, where it was uncommon in my mother's generation, in the time of her generation, for a woman to work. Now you'll find a lot of families in India where both the husband and the wife, or the man and the woman, both are working. And so I was fascinated going back to India after all these years, of decades even, and of course I was not labeled Indian anymore. They call people who come back or people who've been away NRIs, which is non-resident Indian, which is a euphemism. It means a lot of things, actually, if you unpack the term. But as an NRI, going back to India and observing the new working life, if you will, of people at all levels of society was rather eye-opening for me. And therefore, a lot of my stories are about that, as well as my work and time in the UK and the US.
Thanks. I have so many questions about your individual stories, your books. But I also wanted to talk about, what it is to be a writer. I mean, you've been talking about that, Jenny, but, to be a writer outside your own home culture. And there's a quote that I liked by the American writer called Carrie Arsenault. She's written a book called Milltown, about growing up in a small town in Maine that was a mill town. And her line, one of the lines that really struck me was, home is the heart of human identity. And that really resonated for me. And I was even thinking of my father, who had grown up in Lahore, well, as a young boy, and how when he talked about Lahore, which he had to flee because they were Hindus, so they had to leave that partition, it was always with a very different sense than any other place, like even though his family moved to Delhi. And so I thought, that line really makes a lot of sense, as home is the heart of human identity. And then I was thinking, like, what about all of us writers in the diaspora? We're not at home, right? We're not living in the home where we were born. And so what happens to our identities? And if your identity is in question, what can you write authentically about? And this question of authenticity and writers, outside India, whether they're writing about India, how authentic are they? There's been criticism of writers like, Bharati Mukherjee and Jhumpa Lahiri, the people who published early, were the first Indian writers really to gain recognition in the US, that they are somehow catering to American expectations. that their characters, especially women, might be like, sort of proving the supposed superiority of American culture. Like they come from India, they're oppressed, then they shed all these encumbrances and they're liberated women or whatever it is. And so I was wondering, does this question arise with either of you, of your identity, how authentically you're writing, especially if you write about, your homes? Vinod, in your case, of course, it's Mauritius, it's not India. And Jenny, you're writing, you wrote stories set here, but you also have quite a few stories set in India. So, and I'm also wondering if there is some legitimacy to that criticism that the Indian writer in the West somehow internalizes the Eurocentric expectations of, what you can write or how much you need to explain, or, putting foreign words in italics. I think it's all changed recently, that people from other.
I think Parul froze, is it?
Yeah, it looks like it, yeah. Well, maybe you can answer the question, Jenny.
But
and then
I'm wondering how you handled.
Okay,
Oh, she's back.
She's back.
Okay. Did you hear my question, Vinod? I was just wondering.
Yeah, we heard. Yeah.
Okay.
So in my case, being from Mauritius, which is a very small island, the situation, I think, is different from India, because when I was growing up, I went to the best high school on the island. No one, not my favorite teachers, no one ever talked about writing as a career. The leading writer at that time in Mauritius was Malcolm de Chazal, and he was revered in Paris. But in Mauritius, he was thought of as a madman. So in that culture, the writers, you'll find like today, we have leading French Francophone writers from Mauritius, but they don't live in Mauritius. And you have Ananda Devi, you have Natasha Apana, you have Leclésio, and they all have written about Mauritius, but also about other places. The latest novel from Ananda Devi is set in India, and Natasha Apana has written, has set novels in the Comore Islands, and Leclésio, our Nobel Prize winner, also writes about all kinds of places. So I kind of don't worry about the question. I don't worry whether I'm authentic or not. I don't think Mauritian writers do that. Recently, I've been in touch with Mauritian writers who live in Mauritius. One of whom has just had his novel translated in the US. And I don't recall anyone, any literary critic in Mauritius raising that issue. Mind you, I, in the US now, what is sort of my identity? Since I graduated from university, I've been working in an international institution, in an international environment. My friends are American, Japanese, Hungarian, Korean, Indian. So I would say, like, I wrote my novel from the point of view of a middle-aged cosmopolitan person. So consequently, for instance, I write about religion in Mauritius. And my take on the Hindu religion, the Hindu community, Hindu identity is is unique in the sense that I view the Hindu family, the Hindu community, the Hindu religion, not only as nurturing, because these are nurturing. At the same time, I view them as potentially oppressive. And that I show very clearly in my novel. So that's my that's my approach to questions of Hindu identity in Silent Winds, Dry Seas.
And you, Jenny, has this question, has it ever been in your mind? And also, as I say, this kind of internalizing of the expectations or the thinking of maybe, the Eurocentric vision is something almost not intentional, but almost unconscious. I'm just wondering if these are any things that have come up for you in your writing.
Yeah, actually, I mean, within the small groups of Indian American writers, especially my cohorts, people who had books out in 2020, and we were doing events together, panels like this one. This was a topic that came up quite often, especially as some who had published earlier, and the feedback that they might have received from agents and publishers about, it's not exotic enough, or can we italicize these words, or can you explain what, a certain word means or phrase means, even though it may be in the Oxford English Dictionary, so we did have these conversations about how there was a point in time, I think it has changed now, as you said, Parul, but there was a point in time when works had to be made more accessible for the non-Indian or non-South Asian readers. And certainly, I mean, there is some merit to doing that, especially if we want literature itself to cross boundaries and have readers beyond our own communities. However, as you rightly pointed out, there have been other writers, BIPOC writers from other communities who have pushed back on this, and successfully done so, which has paved the way for us as well to push back a little and say, I don't want to italicize these words. If it's made it into the OED, let people go and look it up, or let them Google it now, because it's easy enough to do so. So the question of authenticity, which is related to this, making works accessible versus remaining authentic, it's actually a two-edged sword, I find, the authenticity charge, if you will. And there have been essays on this topic since the late 1980s, from Bharti Mukherjee onwards. Now, Mukherjee was interesting. You mentioned her. She, as an immigrant to US and then Canada, she often tried to write about Indian Americans in the US. She wasn't trying to write about India back home, but she obviously wanted to make sure that she was addressing the cultural markers and aspects. And so I think there was a point in time within Desi writing, as I call it, or Indian American writing or South Asian writing, where publishers wanted more and more of certain kinds of stereotypes and tropes. They wanted to see more of certain kinds of women protagonists or men protagonists. And for better or for worse, over time on social media, this became known as #mango discourse, because it was all about, the exotic mango and, saris and monsoons and writing about chai latte or whatever, So there are certain stereotypes and tropes. And then when writing about India, and I've mentioned this as well, there are certain books that sell better if they happen to be about arranged marriage, if they happen to be about slum sagas, if they happen to be about terrorism. There are certain tropes or certain themes that resonate more with Western publishing. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason is it's reinforcing, or as I say, it's confirmation bias. It's confirming certain biases that Western publishers may have about South Asian countries of the region. And so what happens is then those are the books that not only get published, but they get, picked up by publishing gatekeepers, even mainstream media critics who laud them in major media venues. And then they are seen as representative of the whole region. And then what happens is it gets harder for other people, other writers who are trying to not write about those things, but write about other aspects of the culture. Because if they're not addressing or not confirming biases that publishers may have, it's harder. So I think this whole authenticity charge, that's why I say it's a two-edged sword, because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're damned within your own community of writers. They'll say, oh, you're pandering to a Western gaze, right? You're pandering to these Western biases and stereotypes and tropes. So that's one aspect. And then you're damned if you don't, Because if you don't have some of that, if you're not confirming certain biases of mainstream publishers, it can get that much harder. So, I mean, I sympathize, and I think it's a lot better today. I mean, as you rightly said, it is a lot better today, because I think publishing in general is getting more enlightened, and they understand that when you have a writer like Vinod or like myself, where we have hyphenated identities, we live with one foot on this side of the hyphen and one foot on that other side of the hyphen. We're perched on both arms, if you like, that our viewpoint will necessarily be different from what it used to be, or what a writer in India will write about, for example. And, you know, I'm reminded of Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie's thrice-winning Booker novel or whatever, turned 40 this year. He wrote an essay in The Guardian, and he wrote something which I can't quote his exact words, I'll paraphrase. He wrote something about how he often thinks about how he wrote the book sitting in London, about an India that was in the 80s, 70s and 80s, right? Or even before, from the partition onwards. And he says, now looking back, I would say that wasn't the version of India, it was my version of India. And there are many, many countless versions of India, as there should be, as many writers, right? And so I think that's one thing for all of us to keep in mind when we talk about diasporic writing, that there are many versions. And one last thing I'll mention is, I personally, on a personal level, I do have concerns when a diasporic writer who's never lived in India, who's never been to India, then writes a whole book in India. Yes, you can do research, just like I could do, but with historical fiction, for example, because I've never lived in that period or place, but I can still write historical fiction if I want to. And I support writers who've put in that time and effort to do a lot of good research. And I think, for example, of Priyanka Champaneri, her debut novel, The City of Good Death, which is set in Kashi or Varanasi, and she's never been there. But she did tons of research, and the book shows how she did that. And of course, research now today is easier because of YouTube and online sources and academic sources. So I support writers who want to write about places they've never been to, if they've done the research and if they avoid the common stereotypes and tropes. But unfortunately, there are still writers who are going to want to bring in those stereotypes and tropes because that's how they're going to get their book published by a big publisher. So, yeah.
I will just interrupt because I think we're coming towards the end of our session. I think that, you know, this whole topic is, especially for us writers here in the US, it's a very deep topic. There are so many aspects to it, including, I'm sorry, I won't be able to come. There was a question we had, but hopefully it's been addressed even in an indirect way. But I think that one important thing for writers of the diaspora is to value our own stories. And I think that might not have happened earlier, right? Because the dominant European white culture was very, very dominant. And I think recently, with the unfortunate, tragic murder of George Floyd, so many things have changed in America, including the publishing industry, including the arts. They are now making a very concerted effort to include diverse voices, to get, you know, people of color onto their editorial teams and writing direct messages to them, diversify your publications. So that change has also, I think, given writers of color new confidence about the value of their stories. So, you know, things work kind of hand in hand, what happens politically, what happens on a social level, and then what happens internally with the writer. Okay, so thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you everyone who's listened in. It's been a pleasure to be with you, Vinod and Jenny, and a pleasure to be part of the Jaipur Literature Festival. And I hope one day that in the not too distant future, it can go back to being an in-person event. Thanks.
Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod, Jenny, and Parul for a riveting conversation, giving insights and sharing all your perspectives on the nuances of diaspora writing. Thank you. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available through the Brazos bookstore. If you like the session, please do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. We sincerely value all the contributions that we receive. We thank our JLF Houston advisors, donors, and partners for generously supporting us. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in for the next session, Epic Women, Namita Gokhale, Ira Mukhorty, and Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni in conversation with Suneet Tandon. This will be at 12 p.m. Central Time, which is 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Mountain Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and 10:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And now we present a reading from the JLF Writer Short Series.
Hi, this is Chitra Divakaruni, and I'm going to read to you a short passage from my novel, The Forest of Enchantments, which retells this age-old story of Sita in her own voice. I'm going to read from the middle of the book, a place where Sita is telling Ram something very important that she wants. Ram has just decided that he has to go to the forest, and he has asked Sita to stay back in the city to take care of his parents. I paced my bedroom in a fever of impatience, but fortunately I didn't have to wait long. Although Dasharath and Kaushalya and the sobbing Sumitra, for news had traveled quickly to her, as bad news tends to, had begged them to stay at least one more night, the brothers decided to leave Ayodhya the very same day. "I've come to get my weapons and say goodbye," my husband said as he strode in. "Please don't delay me." He spoke rapidly, as though he'd rehearsed the words several times. I could see he was afraid I was going to indulge in histrionics. Well, he was about to be surprised. "I'm depending on you to take care of my parents in my absence," he added, his tone all business. But I saw the way his hand clenched his bow, the knuckles white. "That will be your most important duty when I'm gone," he said. "I'm sorry," I said, very sweetly. "I'm not going to be able to do that. You see, I'm going to the forest with you." His brows snapped together. "What folly is this? You can't possibly come with me. You're a woman. It's too dangerous. I won't allow it." I wanted to say, "Not all women are weak and helpless like you think." But I remembered my mother's teachings, kept those thoughts to myself, and chose my words carefully. If this was going to work, and it had to, because I couldn't imagine living in this mausoleum of a palace without him, I had to appeal to Ram in the right way. "You're a fine one to talk of duty," I said. "If I'm not misremembering my wedding vows, didn't I say that my foremost duty as your faithful spouse was to follow you even to the ends of the earth? To be with you in riches and poverty? You can't deprive me of my wifely right." Duty, right, those are the terms that Ram understood best, so I used them. But beneath them I was saying, "I love you, I need you, don't abandon me."
So in that sense, I want to democratize the story of innovation. I want to make it clear that anyone can do it.
The basic question that a writer asks, I think, is, what should I write about? And, you know, that's the biggest question. You know, there's no help for you either. And it's a total mystery.
But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard system.
We're absolutely delighted to be back here with our edition, albeit digitally, of JLF Houston. There are so many wonderful authors and speakers who you will hear over the next few days. And I hope they will power your imagination as they have ours to look into the future, into a brighter tomorrow.